In 1840, a Victorian industrialist by the name of James Bateman purchased a modest house at Biddulph near Stoke-on-Trent. According to a contemporary account, it was situated in a lofty, inhospitable region surrounded by a swampy moor. The house he turned into a fine mansion, and the garden, well, that was another matter. But James Bateman had a passionate interest in plants, and that passion, combined with great wealth and a tremendous vision, resulted in what some people describe as one of the finest and most fabulous Victorian gardens ever created. James Bateman's leap of imagination produced a fantasy world.
Now, Roy, this is what we call the rocky glen, imitating...
Every path led to a different land, as I discovered when shown round by Julian Gibbs of the National Trust.
This came from the moor, didn't it?
It came from up the moor. All the stone was brought in, laid, looking very naturalistic.
A good mixture of plants here. Would these have been here originally?
Most of them. And Bateman originally planted Bhutan and Sikkim rhododendrons, which didn't survive because they weren't hardy enough. And it's all this area here which Bateman planted his ferns, and he's recorded in a letter as saying Mrs. Bateman had the fern mania here. And up here is some steps leading to a rather exciting tunnel. Shall we go up?
You bet. Where are we going?
Wait and see.
This was like no other garden I had seen. Caves led from one area to another. Julian first made this journey 4 years ago when he persuaded the National Trust to take on the garden, and that's where our journey begins. Biddulph then was a sad reflection of its former glory.
Well, this is China. As you can see, it's in really rather a derelict state. Sadly, it suffered from terrible vandalism over the years. But, we're about to start work, and it'll all get going again. It's going to change. The Chinese bridge over there, you can see, is a relatively modern replacement of the original. It was much more detailed, the original, and we know exactly what it's like from photographs. It's really going to be quite a revolution when it is all done. It's going to be absolutely stunning.
No one has cared more for the gardens at Biddulph than Basil and Eric. Eric was head gardener for 20 years, and between them, they've spent the best part of a century working the soil. But despite their best efforts, they've been unable to halt the garden's decline.
Well, I left school in August 1939. I started work here with my father on the 1st of September 1939. That was the first time I saw it.
1945, I think it was, when I first came in the January. Do you see, in the early days, when I first started here, to get a job at the Grange was a honour. There were very, very few jobs going at the Grange. Once people got a job here, they didn't finish until they retired more often than not.
One of the first jobs we ever did, we put a new front in Egypt that was taken down and a complete new front put in. It was in 1939. It lasted till, till they've put this new one in now.
We knew that it was a Victorian garden, and we knew that there were certain, such as the Dahlia Walk, certain things had been there in the past, but we had no idea what they were like.
And as I say, we've seen it turn the full circle now, because when we were lads, as I say, we've actually talked to people that had been here 50 years then when we started. I mean, myself, I've actually talked to men that were here in 1896 when it got burnt down.
Then we realised how important we were.
The original house at Biddulph was built in the Italian style. Geological galleries, camellia and rhododendron houses reflected the owner's love of nature. But it was the garden that created excitement. The formality of the time had given way to wild naturalism, which was to spawn a revolution in garden design. Even in Victorian times, there were gardening magazines. This is the Gardener's Chronicle, in its time a prestigious publication. And this would have been read by anyone with a keen interest in gardening. The strange goings-on at Biddulph Grange Gardens were followed with great enthusiasm. There were many articles and a series of detailed drawings by Edward Kemp, a well-known landscape designer. They show how Bateman had concentrated many parts of the world in an area of only 15 acres. The visitor could take a circular route through the garden, starting in Italy, then through the Scottish Glen to China. From there to Egypt, and then the Pinetum and Arboretum, which contained trees from all continents of the world. Going off to one side of the garden was a spectacular avenue of Wellingtonia trees. There was a smaller avenue of limes, several formal gardens, and areas for garden games, which the Victorians liked so much: tennis, bowling and quoits. For James Bateman, the garden became an obsession, which took some 20 years to complete. Already an influential botanist, he was fascinated by accounts of new plant species that were being discovered in distant parts of the world. He wanted to reproduce those exotic landscapes in his own Staffordshire garden, the Himalayas, China and America. Bateman the botanist was joined in this adventure by Edward Cook, an influential artist who had a particular appreciation for landscape. They used hundreds of tons of rock, all placed by hand, to create these scenes. China was the jewel in the crown. Tragically, James Bateman only enjoyed his garden for a few years. It had been a massively expensive exercise that consumed his wealth and left him virtually penniless. Biddulph was bought by the local MP and industrialist, Robert Heath, who continued to care for the garden. The fire destroyed the original house, and in 1922 it became an orthopaedic hospital. Most of the parterres and the dahlia walk were raised to make space for temporary hospital wards, and thus began the slow demise of the garden. The buildings in the garden fell into disrepair and then became the focus of horrific vandalism.
The trouble was the buildings were vandalised, they were broken down. They were smashing the place up, these youths that get on were. We used to repair them, but it got so bad that we couldn't repair after a while. So the health authority didn't seem to be too interested in that kind of thing, so we just carried on keeping the place as tidy as we could garden-wise.
We've had people on drugs down China. It got to a stage you didn't know what you were going to find.
But they always kept the staff down as low as they could, you know, so you could never really keep it quiet as it should have been kept.
By now, most of the buildings were derelict. To all intents and purposes, Biddulph's garden was a lost cause. But there were still people who cared. A group of enthusiasts formed a committee to save the garden before it was lost forever. Peter Hayden's book about Biddulph helped to raise funds and kept interest in the garden alive, although at the time he felt that the final winter was drawing in.
Really practically given it up for lost not so long ago. Well, I was a member of the steering committee, and for several frustrating years we negotiated with the health authority, trying to get a lease of the garden so that we could set about restoring it on a voluntary basis. We had the idea that if we raised about £30,000 we could really do something about it, and now that I see how much the trust is spending here, I realise that we really wouldn't have got very far.
In practice, Biddulph was to cost £2,350,000. Funds were provided from the National Heritage Memorial Fund, English Heritage and the National Garden Scheme. And the District Council bought the house. The balance had to come from donations.
There was an appeal launched to raise the money to buy the garden for the National Trust, and then it became apparent how much work was going to have to be done to get it into a condition where it could be seen by the general public. So over the ensuing months, estimates were made as to the amount required, and the new appeal was launched, which in fact is for a sum of £800,000 to ensure the restoration of the garden and also to make a future for the garden in the form of an endowment.
The National Trust had to decide whether to preserve it in its present state or go back 120 years. Bateman himself was constantly altering features in his quest for perfection, a mid-Victorian style that has only recently found favour.
Victorian gardens are have not always been popular, and they were regarded as peculiar. The garden here was regarded as peculiar and interesting, but not something to be loved at that time. And it's only in the last 10 years perhaps, that Victorian gardens have become acceptable. We've decided to put the garden back as far as possible to Bateman's day, but we have to take into account the surroundings. It was a much more outward-looking garden in those days. We now have things on the horizon that we don't like the look of. We have to think about the number of staff we can afford to employ. It means that we've got to cut the garden down to simplify it compared with Bateman's time. It's got to change because things have grown. Things are that much bigger than they used to be. And this creates all kinds of miscellaneous problems of planting and rearrangement. And gardens really are not objects that you preserve. They are really processes that you manipulate.
This was to be the most ambitious garden restoration ever undertaken by the Trust. The first task was to excavate the areas buried in the hospital period.
They've just started digging out the Dahlia Walk, which is the most dramatic part of the project. We did a certain amount of archaeology to start off with to find out if it really is there, was there, and it jolly well is. This is a feature which was filled in the 1930s when there were temporary hospital buildings erected on the site. We weren't absolutely sure how much of it was there, and it's very exciting how much is being revealed now. So this is going to be the big feature, new feature to the garden. But it's been extremely exciting this last month, discovering all this. And of course, in order to make a sensible contract of it, we have used a lot of archaeology. We've had archaeologists working here, and we have discovered all the number of original beds as well as the Dahlia Walk. Gosh.
Now, Julian, we have now found the foundations for Bateman's parterre features. It's gratifying that they do survive in some form, sufficient anyway to get a plan of them, and
right.
we will be able to confirm the research very well.
So we will be able to put it back exactly as it was. That's the great thing.
Yes, yes.
Eric stuck to the traditional method of double digging. No easy task in this soil.
On this site, we're dealing with a site which has been backfilled by the health authority in the 1920s. They needed a level area to erect some temporary wards. And they imported a lot of soil and levelled up the ground, which was formerly a complex of 3 parterres. By parterres I mean little enclosed gardens enclosed by low ashlar stone walls and yew hedgerows. On my left side are the surviving remains of the Dahlia Walk. Now the Dahlia Walk was originally a sunken pathway. It was a linear feature with dry stone walls on either side, big retaining walls. We need to put back the garden as it was in its most flamboyant phase and try to remove the later accretions of garden modification, for there were many and they occurred within a short period. So this is really the purpose of the archaeology on the site. It's only by excavating it carefully that we can really separate out the different stages of change and reconstruction on the garden.
Inside the house, transforming the old operating theatre into a tea room was the task of the architect.
With a great
Baroque
frame.
He was also going to have to recreate garden buildings that had been completely destroyed.
There's been a lot of photographs which are sort of family views and things like that of the gardens, which incidentally show some features of buildings. I mean, a lot of the most interesting information hasn't come because someone's decided to photograph something. It's come because they've been photographing a family group or whatever, and it just so happens that there's a bit of an interesting building stuck in the background of it. For a long time we were working on the shelter house, and we had a country life front view of the shelter house, which was very useful. We had no back view of the shelter house at all. And then fortunately we stumbled across this photograph of the Heath children and their nanny, which just happens to have the shelter house at the back of it. To a casual viewer it wouldn't necessarily be recognised as being the shelter house at all. But it actually gave us an awful lot of useful information.
In the new situation, the role of head gardener was going to be critical and very different in scope. Nigel Davis, who already had experience with the trust, came in, and happily, Eric and Basil agreed to stay on and help.
We're clearing about 11 trees that were planted here in the 1950s to replace some Irish yews that were on this bank. And they're not really in keeping with the Chinese garden that was here. Although the varieties were around, they're not actually what was here at the time. And so we want to get back to the Irish yews that were there in the original garden. We have to be careful here that we don't disturb too much of the rock work as well. So it's got to be done carefully. Part of the view that should be seen from the Chinese temple is a willow pattern, and we should be able to see the joss house at the top. With these trees partly obscure that view, so by clearing them as well, we do open up that view. And it also lets in a lot more light into the garden, which means that we can grow a wider range of plants than we have now.
Jamie, I'm getting awfully worried because they're about to start coming down here with the digger. Do we have all the information from your archaeology?
The excavator does now know exactly the parameters of the feature and will have no difficulty in tracing.
And he's been reliable. He knows what he's looking for. That's the important thing.
They're being extremely vigilant and intelligent about it.
Good.
I'll show you.
Good. Well, we've just in the nick of time we've kept ahead of them, which is what was worrying me.
Egypt was the second candidate for Nigel's saw.
These obelisks over the years have become overgrown. They originally were tall pillars with 2 layers of yews at the base. The outer layer was green yew, the middle layer was a golden yew. What's happened over the years is that the yew has overgrown and has completely overshadowed and killed out the gold, and the only way we can restore it is to completely cut back the yew and prepare the ground and replant the golden yew and the outer line of green. The only way we can do it is rather drastic. We could have taken out the centre yew as well. Doing it this way, we can get a green pillar quite quickly, and we can get the height very, very much quicker.
The yew of the obelisks is our common or native species, Taxus baccata, while the golden version, aurea, is one of several similar kinds popular from Victorian times. Indeed, no Victorian garden was considered complete without its complement of evergreens, and Biddulph was no exception. Yews and conifers apart, there were numerous broad-leaved evergreens, such as the dogged laurel or spotted laurel, or Cuba japonica maculata, a robust Japanese shrub with its handsome gold-spotted leaves. But of all the evergreens grown by the Victorians, none was more valued than the English holly, of which both male and female forms were available. Only the females, of course, produce the familiar berries, and to achieve this, a male holly must be planted in the vicinity to provide the necessary pollen. Berries weren't everything, however, and countless hollies were selected for their gold or white variegated leaves. Two of the most prized were Golden Queen, with gold-margined, boldly spined leaves, and Silver Queen, with creamy white margined leaves on dark shoots. Both these hollies, despite what you might presume, are male, the names merely referring to their beautiful foliage. Other hollies have leaves more curious than beautiful. One of the most distinct of English hollies, and certainly one of the oldest, is this one. It's known as Ferox argentea, and the name means with cream or silvery spines. We know it in English as the silver hedgehog holly. And you can see why. When you look at those leaves, all those small, creamy white prickles which pepper the upper surface, especially towards the tips and on the margins. When it comes to choosing a holly for a special position, particularly a lawn or by water, few can better Pendula, the weeping holly. This fine specimen by the lake was planted in 1860. Part the branches and you can see the short, sturdy trunk firmly ensconced on a small rocky knoll. In the gardens here, you will find plants from all over the world. Biddulph is a child of the 19th century enthusiasm for exotic species of trees and shrubs. It was the task of the botanist Michael Lear to hunt out and identify the plants that survived, but it took a little bit longer than originally envisaged.
In '86, they asked for a one-week survey to look at least the woody plants. And from that 1 week, 6 months later, we produced a report on the history of the gardens. We sort of had to approach this from both ends. We looked historically and what was here as it was in 1986, and then we tried to sort of make sense of how the two met.
What were your feelings when you first saw Biddulph from the gardens?
Well, I didn't particularly like it, really. I thought it was, I couldn't quite see its appeal, and I must admit it was one of those gardens that, as we spent longer and longer here, the sort of magic of the place began to emerge. And we really turned into sort of horticultural detectives trying to unravel the mystery of how the garden had changed so much and how this amazing plant collection that had been built up had sort of gone and where it had gone. And crucial to it was really sort of understanding the age of the plants and how subsequent owners of Biddulph Grange had put their stamp on, and we had to unpeel it layer by layer to get back to the original concept. And we found there were these plants here of enormous historical and horticultural importance, such as the plant introductions of Robert Fortune. What was so complex here was that plants were moved around a lot in the late Victorian and turn of the century by the subsequent owners. So even if we found a plant, it might not have been where Kemp had described it originally.
So it was like a great jigsaw.
It was a great jigsaw. And we used photographs a lot. Photographs were invaluable in working out how the garden design had changed, how Bateman had changed his own design before he sold it. And it's amazing what you can identify from old photographs. And they help with the aging because you could work out the sort of height of a particular tree, and from that you could deduce when it had roughly been put in. Even a dinner plate with a painting on it proved crucial in unpicking the evolution of the design. And so this material just seemed to just accumulate, and then it was all presented in the report, cross-referenced to explain how the garden changed.
By the first spring, the Dahlia Walk had been uncovered, and building work was going on apace, including the visitor facilities and car park. This has to be one of the most colourful areas of the garden, Michael. Would there have been rhododendrons here in Bateman's time?
There were. In fact, this was the part of the garden called the rhododendron grand. And what we've been trying to do is work out which ones are originals and which ones aren't. And it's very difficult because some of these clumps have been cut down to the base. They've been coppiced once, perhaps twice. So they might look younger than they actually are. And we know for a fact that subsequent owners of Biddulph planted rhododendrons. So there's a whole mixture of different varieties, some actually unknown seedlings, planted over quite a range of time. So this one here, I think we're looking at a hardy hybrid, and they're very hard to identify. And we think this is one called Blandianum.
Would this be a plant that Bateman put in at that time?
Well, I think it could well be. We don't know for sure, but this particular variety was raised in 1848, so the timing would seem right.
How big is this one now?
Well, being quite large and sprawling, it was originally planted at the back, and if you follow the stems right back, they layer themselves to about 30 feet right at the top of the bank. So it's over that long period they just crept down to the front.
Giant. The rhododendrons in the Lime Avenue have pushed forward and smothered beds of ivy that James Bateman originally planted under the lime trees. Eric and Basil have the critical task of cutting back the plants as far as John and Nigel dare.
Because they're all layers, and we don't know quite what we're going to uncover. We know we've got an ugly fence,
Yes.
but, and you've got plenty of depth here. The great thing is we've got 2 years, and we've got to get that refurnished in 2 years from now.
Almost every tree in the garden needed some degree of surgery, occasionally quite severe. The obelisks in Egypt are sadly giving cause for concern, but elsewhere the hard treatment is producing the desired result. Having removed certain trees to let in more light, Nigel now concentrates on the equally important task of improving the soil. It'll take a year or so to get the peony bed back in good heart.
It's really hasn't been dug over for such a long time that it's been very stagnant. There's been no air in it, and it needs opening up, the air bringing in, and it just helps it to break down a lot easier. We're a bit behind, basically, because of the delays in getting the building work finished, which obviously puts back our work. But we've been able to get on with other areas, and gradually, as the builders are releasing areas that they've completed, we can then carry on with our side and clean up after them. Where we are at the moment in China, we're now starting to clean and prepare the beds ready for planting this spring. There isn't really a big budget for it, but what we try to do is try and find other National Trust properties and other gardens where we can get hold of some of the plants without actually having to pay for them. So it's a case of borrowing and begging and so forth. So we try and get as much as possible without actually buying them.
It will take thousands of ivies to fill these beds in the Lime Avenue, but ivies root easily from cuttings, and that's how most of them will be grown. Nigel's main concern are the specialist plants.
There's going to be a lot of specimen plants that we're not able to plant this year. We're having trouble obtaining a lot of them. So it's going to be it's more of a long-term process, that one. It's been a case of looking through various nursery catalogues, ringing nurseries up, sending them our lists of plants that we're looking for, and most of them have been helpful, and we are in the process now of ordering and collecting plants and awaiting deliveries. So we're hoping to have quite a lot in this year. Some of the more select ones are going to be extremely difficult to get hold of. We may well have to go back to seeds or cuttings, grafting, or even
perhaps collecting back in the wild.
Many of the plants first grown at Biddulph came from wild places and were among the first to be introduced to Britain.
James Bateman had a passionate interest in plants. At university, James employed his very first plant hunter, a man called Thomas Colley. And in 1833, Colley was packed off to British Guiana to look for and collect orchids. Many species resulted from that expedition, and one of them was this beautiful one here, Oncidium lancianum. It was already known, it had been named, but it was so beautiful, it was so rare that it caused a sensation in Europe and in Britain, and people wanted more. James Bateman wanted it. And here was this man, Colley, a tree full of this orchid, and he knew that there was another collector for somebody else, a rival, only a day and a half behind him. They were so competitive in those days that Colley had no compunction in stripping the entire tree of that orchid.
Orchids were sent back to Britain by the ton, and in tremendous variety. Elaborate glass houses were created to house the plants. It was also the heyday of the botanical artist.
This is one of the most impressive botanical books ever published. It's certainly the largest and must be one of the heaviest. It's known as an elephant folio. James Bateman's The Orchidaceae of Mexico and Guatemala. It was published in parts starting in 1837 when James was only 26 years old, and it established his credentials in the botanical world.
In the 6 years between 1835 and 41, over 1,000 new orchids were introduced to Britain. At Biddulph Grange, Bateman wasn't restricted to tender plants. He looked to exotic but hardier species.
There can be few people who don't recognise the monkey puzzle or chili pine from the swollen base of its trunk, just like an elephant's foot, right up to that straight as a gun barrel stem to the characteristic spidery head. It's one of the curiosities of the plant world. Male and female flower clusters are often produced on separate trees. The females, when fertilised, developing large heavy cones, which take 2 years to mature. It's a native of the Andes of Chile and Argentina, and was first found in the Chilean province of Arauco, where live the Araucano Indians, hence the botanical name, Araucaria.
In the 1850s, there were also 4 very small araucarias in a parterre by the lake.
The Archaeology parterre is on the terrace. It's linked to the end of the Dahlia Walk, and it was a formal parterre of monkey puzzles in 4 quarters. We discovered it was here. We expected to find it, mind you, because we had the Kemp drawings from the Gardens Chronicle articles. And we're now sort of at last realizing all what we thought was here.
So I don't think, you can't say that the archaeology doesn't say...
There's a slight difference of opinion, though, between the 19th century drawings and the recent archaeology.
Is the archaeology the foundation, the original foundation?
Yeah,
it's quite likely that the foundation was put into a curve and then a...
It's very much a rectilinear bit of the garden.
There's a lot of difficulties in any decisions about what you should do, but with the amount of survey work which Anthony Blackley has been able to undertake, his survey work combined with Kemp, we've now been able to decide really how the Archaeology parterre will fit together.
There are other bits in that plan which are a bit peculiar, and rather it's suggesting that possibly the work wasn't complete at the time of surveillance.
Well, I think the best bet is to stick to this proposal for now. I think it's very good.
It was
the architect's idea to get a skin diver to try and get the stone that had come up the balustrade into the pool. This is one of our foremen on Alvins who does skin diving, and he offered to come and help the trust in getting them out. That is the only way. Well, it's the cheapest way, let's put it that way.
In recovering these stones, the workmen also discovered some useful artifacts.
There ain't no big ones like that again, is there, Rob?
Yeah.
Is there?
There's loads of them.
We've been very lucky to have discovered a tremendous lot of rotten pieces of building, remains of buildings, in the pond and the ice house. And so we've dredged the pond and we've emptied the ice house and discovered an enormous, much more original material than we ever dreamt we would. But unfortunately, these kind of fragments of previous lives of the buildings have come to light gradually. I mean, things have been found in piles of leaf mould and things like that, and therefore we've actually often got quite a long way down the road in terms of doing drawings of buildings, and then we suddenly found a new bit of information which meant we got to go not quite back to square one, but we had to rethink a lot of our ideas. When we first got involved with the job, we were unaware that there had been any special decorative roof tiles, but then we started to produce from the ice house or the pond fragments of glazed coloured tiles, and this set us off on research, which ended up by us approaching H&R Johnson, the tile manufacturers, to see if they could produce replicas. They actually found the page in the catalogue showing the tiles.
There's a chocolate there that actually we haven't seen.
No. Yeah, we've not found any of that chocolate.
Yeah.
The only ones we've found are the turquoise, the yellow, the red and the black.
Les, I think we're nearly there anyhow. I mean, you've already done an awful lot of the tiles.
Well, yes, these are some, and obviously the red.
The floor tiles of the Chinese temple are called encaustics. The patterns are produced by using a range of coloured clays. Stoke-on-Trent is one of the very few places in Europe where this craft survives.
A lot of these, of course, are rather slightly medieval, aren't they? Because a lot of them were used in Victorian churches.
The floor tiles were rather less sure ground there to know exactly what the floor tiles were like in the main part of the temple. So we haven't yet come to any conclusion about how exactly it should be refloored, but we are discussing this with H&R Johnson at the moment to see if we can come up with a suitable encaustic or encaustic type flooring for the rest of the temple that will be compatible with the panels of original tiles that we still retain.
I think we're onto something. I think we're moving to the right decision. Yeah.
Some of the most fascinating, if less obvious members of the China garden are small perennials. They've got nothing whatsoever to do with China the country, nor is it recorded from whence they came. Look closely at this moss-covered rock, and you'll see this trailing plant with paired, rounded leaves. That's the common moneywort, which is a kind of Lysimachia, and it's fairly common in Britain. It's a native plant of shady places, woodlands and such like.
Look even closer and you'll see another trailing plant. Even smaller, scalloped leaves, slender thread-like stems, and tiny flowers. This is the Cornish monuet, no relation, Sibthorpia europea. Now, believe it or not, this is in the same family as the foxglove. In the wild, this little plant is found in the southern counties from Sussex westwards into Cornwall, and also in South Wales, but it's not a native of these parts. So how did it get here? It's quite possible that Edward Cook, who was known to be a great fern enthusiast and went on many fern forays, especially in the southwest of the country where ferns occur in great numbers, might have seen this and introduced it deliberately, or maybe accidentally, on one of these rocks with ferns he was collecting. China is also the home of Biddulph's most important resident, but it's a tree you could easily miss. I believe this is considered to be Biddulph's most important tree, is that right?
I think so. This is the golden larch, Pseudolarix amabilis from China. And there's quite a story connected with this. Kemp, writing in 1862, said there were two fine plants. And it's interesting that Robert Fortune, the Scottish plant collector who introduced this, said that by the year 1860, all the large plants in the country had actually come back in a Wardian case to this country, one of these sort of prototype greenhouses that Nathaniel Ward had designed. And so we think this actually travelled as a little seedling. He dug up in China and came on the deck of a ship inside this little greenhouse, 12,000 miles. So it is quite distinct from the larches. It's not a true larch, that's why it's called Pseudolarix.
It's a very fine bark, hasn't it?
It's got a fine bark, and it, being deciduous, it turns a beautiful yellow in autumn.
The Great Wall in China is falling down, and it's taking a small army of masons to put it back. These features were designed by the artist Edward Cook, who made models of the landscapes in clay before bringing the rocks from Biddulph Moor. Andy Linton and his team are using those same traditional techniques to move rocks weighing 2 tons and more.
This was in a huge hole down there. There was none of this rockery there, and we've just really picked the pieces up like a big jigsaw puzzle and rebuilt it basically using this method. I should say that one's about 2 tons, something like that. It's about the heaviest one we've lifted so far. Where we've got stones that we can't really get any lifting equipment in, we have to rig this pole up, use that method. It's the only way you can do it now. Just look like a natural rock face, which is what I think they've tried to achieve on the rest of the garden.
The dry stone walls of the Dahlia Walk have already been finished, and the foundations of the path laid out with edgings and steps. For the first time in 60 years, these beds are being brought back to life, but Nigel only has a couple of years to experiment with the dahlias.
Well, we managed to acquire some old-looking varieties of dahlias from a firm in France, and these came across early in April. We then put them in the greenhouse, encouraged them to shoot, and we've taken some cuttings, and so we've increased the stock already. And what we aim to do is to provide dahlias for each of the bays in the Dahlia Walk. So each bay will have a separate colour. But we're still looking for more varieties, still searching for better ones and nicer ones. And also what we shall do is increase the stock again next year, so that we do have a complete set of dahlias for the Dahlia Walk. It's fairly sheltered, it's south-facing. It's a warm, sunny spot, which they should enjoy.
Every building in the garden requires attention. Most have been vandalised. The detailing on the Cheshire Cottage has disappeared, and the structural timber is unsafe. The National Trust are restoring the buildings to, as near as possible, their original state, preserving what can be saved. But nothing here is what it seems, for the Cheshire Cottage is also an Egyptian pyramid. The dark passage which leads from the Egyptian court was lined with rustic and rather rotten timber work. It needs the skill of a furniture restorer to put it back to its original state.
My job is to actually remove all the old woodwork, i.e. both ceilings, and remove all the rot, cut the rot out and stabilise the timber, and where missing I replace and try and match the original sort of finish and shape, and really the sort of feel of the ceiling. When you're doing a job like this, it has to be right, using the right materials, the right finish at the end of the job, the right look, things sort of looking well cared for, not restored at all. That's really the goal of a good restorer, stroke conserver. I've also managed to, I made the pattern for the finial, which goes on top of the Chinese sort of pagoda. So that was good fun, doing that.
As the Chinese temple rose above the lake, the builders began to realise that this was a job like no other.
It's an ordinary structure of a roof, except that you have straight rafters on a roof, on a house of a roof. This is the other part of the veranda. On top of that, you have laths. It's boarded, it's lathed, and then there's glazed tiles, screwed on top of it. And that's, to me, that's when it will look something like a job that you've never done before in your life, in this country. You're living and learning every day on this site. We're doing different aspects of the job. Throughout this job, that's how it's been. I mean, where else do you get big stones that you have to lift up and stand on edge? That's all in its place. All this has been done round here. It's been carcassed and everything, but this is the most intricate job of the lot, is putting those tiles on that slope. That's where your tradesmanship comes in. In nobody's lifetime they'll be doing a job like this again.
Far away from Biddulph, there's a place where 6 statues go to be restored to health. A place where fallen angels rise again and warriors can recover from the ravages of time. It's here that the buffalo has come for a facelift.
The first thing we did to it when it came into the workshop was take paint samples, which we can send away to be analysed. So, you know, we can tell how many layers there were and what was the bottom layer. But there are a lot of fractures that weren't apparent, but small fractures that weren't apparent, that were hidden under the layers of paint and gilding. There were several solder repairs, like these lighter coloured patches on here. They're rather messy, they've not been done very well. The ear, apparently a bit, was torn off by vandals at some time and thrown into the lake. And then when they started work on the grounds recently, they dredged the lake and found the ear. And so, you know, we now have it and we put it back on. Although it was distorted quite badly where it had been pulled off. And there's also a lot of fracturing around here, which was probably caused at the same time. We've got to put a new supporting armature inside, for which we'll use stainless steel because of its resistance to corrosion, and so it won't cause the same sort of problems. And then it'll go back on site, where I understand it's probably going to be regilded.
Back at Biddulph, the buffalo's body waits patiently for the return of its other half. Where the builders are still working, the gardening will have to wait. But Nigel has the plants for these areas in his nursery, used by the 100. Pines, rhododendrons, and some other plants that are special to Biddulph. As far as possible, these are all varieties as originally used in the garden.
What we have is specimen trees and shrubs. They're kept in here until they're large enough to put out. We have the 4 araucarias, the monkey puzzles, ready for the Araucaria parterre. Hopefully they will go in this autumn as soon as the the contractors have finished restoring that particular feature. We also have the Spirea japonica still in containers. They were introduced by Robert Fortune into the garden at Biddulph, and as far as we know, it's probably the only area, in actual fact, where they still survive. And those ones were growing in the wall of the Chinese temple.
Conifers, including pines, were another fascination for James Bateman. As with rhododendrons, some of his plantings were experimental, and not all survived. But those that have are a magnificent legacy.
Arguably, the most noble tree at Biddulph is this Californian big tree, Sequoiadendron giganteum, sometimes known as the Wellingtonia. In the wild, it grows on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada in California, where there are specimens 250 feet plus and over 3,000 years old. The first main introduction to Britain was in 1853 when William Lobb sent seeds to the nursery firm of Veitch. 2 years later, Bateman was planting this tree as a seedling.
Planted about the same time, and just as impressive, is this group of coast redwood, Sequoia sempervirens. The thick fibrous bark is a reddish brown, while the cones are small and the leaves like those of a yew. Nearby are two fine specimens of the Japanese cedar, Cryptomera japonica, also with reddish bark. In spring, both the ripe brown cones of last year and the developing green cones of the current year are found on the same branch.
No pine eaten worth its salt should be without the East American swamp cypress, Taxodium disticum. There's a trio of rather small but nice-looking specimens on this mound behind me. They're fairly small because I guess that's a rather dry area. Normally they would be planted by water, lakes and rivers and such like. You can also see that they are seedlings because the foliage on each of those specimens is slightly different. This is a very interesting conifer because it's one of the comparatively few conifers that are deciduous, that is, they lose their leaves in the autumn.
The big moment has arrived, and the buffalo's head is back, looking as good as new. The buffalo and several other animal sculptures in the garden were designed by the sculptor Waterhouse Hopkins.
Actually, I was quite surprised to see how good the modelling was on the head. It was quite good work. Obviously, the way it's been carried out, it leaves a lot to be desired, but certainly there's been quite a lot of modelling there, and that's true if you look carefully on the body. Somebody's had a fair idea of the sort of size of the cows, the Hindu cows you see in India. We found when we took the head off there was some wood. I think it was some old chipboarding that had gone rotten. There's a certain amount of plaster and brickwork which made the main body up before they then put the modelling on of the cement render. Now we're just positioning the head into place and we're going to adhere the dowels inside the body of the cow. And then we move on to the second part of the repairs, which is to clean and to consolidate the cement with sodium silicate, which will harden up the surface enough for us to then put on a ground layer for the gilding. The body was gilded before.
In the last few months, the Cheshire cottage has been transformed. The decorative timber has been reproduced, and the original timber is being cleaned up prior to painting.
Well, they did all the face here, up the front, all that woodwork. It was just brick. We put all the woodwork up and it's been plastered since. Put the new window in, and the new oak on top here and down the sides, and then reassembled all this back together again. There weren't one on the top before, you see. This went to the concrete, that concrete up there. So what we've done is, put oak along the top to hold it all together. And then the floor in the building itself, and these ceilings, all the fascia board on the outside. But there's been a lot of graffiti on it. I've got all that off. Jim loves Nelly and stuff like that,
From under the ground, but many miles from Biddulph, they found red and honey-coloured stone, similar to that originally used in the garden buildings and walls. After being cut to the basic shape at the quarry, the stone was hand-finished by the team of masons who spent more than 2 years at Biddulph. The Buffalo is now looking very pleased with itself as Albert and his team complete the delicate task of positioning the heavy canopy that will protect it from the elements.
Can you go down any more, Tony?
I'm off.
It's lovely.
I'm loose here. Right. Just take the weight on that one. Right. That's it. She's in. The difficult part was putting it on its 4 legs, because if we'd have damaged those legs there, we'd have lost everything that we'd done. But now it's in position, and the weight of the...
Yours? What?
Take yours down.
That's it.
Take the weight with your check fittings now, tap them up, so as the poles...
Well, whilst Albert is preoccupied with the Buffalo, the bosses are checking out progress on the temple. This is the most difficult building in the garden because it involves so many craftsmen. The stages have had to be carefully planned so that it will be finished in time, and there's little room for manoeuvre.
We haven't come across anything that we haven't been able to sort out. That wall had to be rebuilt, of course. That has been done now.
Is he on programme, do you think?
Reasonably well.
Yeah.
Seems to be getting there.
Anyhow, again, timing isn't so critical on the tiles, is it?
I think we're going to do the floor in 2 phases, actually. I think we'll probably put the blacks around the perimeter in first.
Right.
Because that'll allow us to finish off the skirting boards and the panelling.
Right.
But I think it's silly to try and put down the encaustics until the very end, in case they get damaged. Right. And then there's the 2 original panels that go back in there. And they've already started making prototypes of the replacements, so they seem quite happy with it. And the black ones around the edge, which were...
All the time, as soon as the workmen move on, the gardeners move in. In the final summer before opening, Nigel's nursery is full of old-fashioned flowers and exotic species from around the world, ready for planting out. The Bhutan and Sikkim rhododendrons for the glen, and 3 new golden larch seedlings to supplement the rare surviving tree in the Chinese garden, which was introduced from China 135 years ago. But when it comes to finding some indoor plants for the house, they're off to the local nursery in search of a bargain.
What we really want to see, Keith, is some camellias. Right? Is that possible?
Bateman used to keep camellias in the house, so they'd be appropriate for the information room or shop, along with a few palms and other traditional indoor plants.
What is it, John? The Howe Island palm?
Yes, it comes from Howe Island.
That's wonderful.
Looking fun. Took half a lorry, that did.
Nigel, well, I think that'll be fine for the garden room.
The garden room, yes. Nice
Fill up
paint and sheet.
We haven't got any pictures.
I'm doing that big enough for you.
Just about, just about. I think it'll actually be perfect in the tea room, which was a billiard room, and it's got a huge glazed ceiling. But I think it'll look all right. And again, it's got a narrow trunk and everything else, and so we can pack the chairs all around it. I don't know where we're going to get all the money for all this.
Well, I suppose the government will...
What?
Cough up, won't they?
The government won't.
It had been decided that the pruned yews in Egypt sadly wouldn't survive, so Nigel and his team determined to recreate the green and gold obelisks from scratch.
That's the new green you requested.
The garden buildings are finished, all bar the paintwork.
That green there
is the old.
Is the new green.
Is the new green. What about in the fascia?
Agreeing on the correct colours, though, from scant references and small chips of surviving paint, is threatening to become a major problem.
That's
this one.
That's the cream. That's the cream we're thinking about. One of those two is the cream. That's a mistake. That one. I would choose between the two, between the red we've already got on and the right one.
Can you tell me the numbers of those two? Because it's the only way one can do it is comparatively.
There's no doubt it was a red. I mean, it was a. They weren't trying to do anything.
That's red. That's the problem.
It was bright red, definitely. I mean, we can go and find your bits if you like, but there's no. The red is a quite uncompromising red. We can spend 3 weeks on this. So I mean, we're not going to. You're not going to sort it in the afternoon just like that. What if we're talking about fine tuning these colours? Then we can have a useful discussion. If you wanted to change the colour scheme, then someone's got to do an awful lot more work.
They were not talking about changing the colour scheme.
In the relative calm of the new greenhouse, Eric and Basil are taking the last of the dahlia cuttings. After a lifetime at Biddulph, they've taken the changes in their stride, including the different styles of planting. Eric can also recollect with a smile his first memories of the garden.
Well, the first days were pretty frightening. I mean, I was the only lad that had worked here. The others were quite elderly people, and it was a little bit frightening for the first few weeks, not the first day. In those days, you got on with your work. They told you what to do, and if you didn't do it or didn't do it right, then it was a smack outside of the ears for not doing it.
And the dahlias you have now, I mean, are they very different from the ones that you knew 40, 50 years ago?
Well, a lot of them are different. They've brought quite a lot of varieties out. Some are quite a lot bigger than the others. Whether they're so much better, I don't know. But I think one drawback with a lot of the flowers is they don't last as long as the old ones had used to do.
Do you think the garden's now as colourful as they used to be, as you remember?
Here?
Yes.
I might be getting in trouble here, but no.
That's what they painted on. You can't suddenly turn that evidence on its head and say we don't like the look of what we've come up with, so we're going to impose a different colour scheme on it.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the interpretation of the scrapes is a difficult thing, and I think as it's a lead paint, that accounts for...
Not lead paint.
No, it was.
It was, yes.
Yes. That accounts for the great lightness that we see in the matched up colours, because it would have chalked and powdered, and therefore you don't see the original colour, you see the...
Well, I mean, I can accept that might be the case, but that isn't a more intense version of that, is it? That's a different colour.
The discussion continued over several weeks, and the Buffalo saw many more coats of paint.
Here's a good example of the authenticity we're trying to achieve here at Biddulph. The builders have just put back this balustrading. This piece here is the last remaining bits of the original. And if you look at the detail,
it's the top capping and the base down there is squared off, and the builders, in copying the design, didn't copy it absolutely accurately. They got a little curve here and a curve here, which is a very modern detail, which all modern joinery does. And unfortunately, they've now got to redo this to get it accurate. It's the sort of thing which not many people would notice, but as soon as you've seen it, it looks totally wrong and is not a 19th century, genuine 19th century detail. This sort of authenticity has been gone on all the way through the whole project. Our architect Anthony Blackley has been absolutely fastidious in every single little detail, much to the fury of the builders, perhaps fury, they've learned to respect it, but they haven't been able to get away with any shortcuts.
Yes, there's some more concrete that's oozed through that needs
I've seen those. I've seen those.
Spiritides that needs sorting out. Well, I would do them in... no, I think leave them green. You can put another coat of green on there.
On them?
Yeah, for now. And then because we want to compare on Friday, we want to be able to compare the red with the green, you see.
So if I put another coat of red.
Put another coat of red on there.
Two coats of green.
Yeah.
Ceilings on two.
We're reached a stage of what we call snagging, which is all the little bits that people have forgotten to do or be done wrong, minor things that need amending and improving. And cumulatively, there's probably 2 or 3 weeks to work there before we're completely finished. But we're very much on the home straight now. We're sort of nearly there. On any job, you have odd disasters and odd bits that are inferior in some respect or another. But where they've been significant, we've corrected them, and where they haven't been significant, we've tolerated them on other occasions. But generally, the quality is perfectly acceptable.
Throughout the last summer, the gardeners followed in the builders' footsteps. As pressure mounted, volunteers helped out, and the garden very quickly took shape. By September, even the final colour of the buffalo canopy was being overshadowed by Nigel's exploratory planting in the dahlia walk.
Now, are these the kind of dahlias that Bateman would have grown?
Well, I don't think so. Most of these are modern varieties that we have available to us. We think that most of Bateman's original varieties have long gone. They've been either frosted out, diseased, virus taken over, and lost in cultivation.
Well, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of varieties certainly in the late Victorian period, weren't there?
Oh, there were. I mean, every nurseryman produced his own varieties, I think, own names for them. There was a tremendous wealth of dahlias available to the Victorian gardener, most of which I think were for floristry work rather than sort of general garden ornamentation.
Right. Well, these look very
distinct, very simple flowers, single flowers.
That's right. These are one of the species that were introduced from Mexico, one of the parents from which all the dahlias have arisen. And they also show something quite similar, which is the variable nature of seed. All these dahlias were grown from seed. You have two separate colours here, which is clearly shown up. Also slight differences in growth and habit. So even within the wild, of course, you've got variation.
What's the name of this one?
This one is Dahlia pinnata.
Yeah. It would have been grown by Bateman, this.
Oh, very much so, yes, it would have been.
How did you set about obtaining these dahlias that you've used in the borders?
Well, some of these were, we purchased last year as initial trial from a nurseryman in France, various ones, but also we had some in the garden from local people had given us dahlias over the years, and some of these obviously we've bulked up and kept. We did actually have one given to us earlier this year, an unknown white. This one, which is already showing quite a lot of iris. Yes. Now, it's not very good, particularly good flower as far as modern varieties go, but we think this one dates back to about 1890.
Right. Well, given that it's got virus, what are the thoughts on this? Would you maintain this or get rid of it?
Well, we'll try and maintain it. We may even try and clean it up. We'll discard the virus ones, try some of the other ones.
And there's a cleaner one, certainly.
That's right, and take cuttings from there next year and try and clean it up a little bit.
Right. Now, given that Bateman himself changed the design of this dahlia walk at one stage, why did the Trust decide to re-establish it to the original design? Any particular reason for this?
Well, one of the original design of actually putting the dahlia walk right back in its entirety was obviously to get our visitors back around in a circulation around the garden. Plus the fact that we also knew it existed, and it had been in the garden for over 20 years before Bateman himself cleared it away. So obviously we wanted to put this one back. And it is a lovely feature to put dahlias back into a garden. There aren't many dahlia borders actually being started these days, and we think it was lovely to do, and we'd like to continue it. And it does give us a lot of colour in the garden at this time of the year.
One of the boldest perennials at this time of the year is the Japanese knotweed, Polygonum cuspidatum, although some people call it Fallopia or Renautria japonica. Very fast-growing plant with these stout stems which are hollow and when dried can be used as pea shooters. Large leaves and these clusters of strings of white flowers from the leaf axils. The native of Japan, it was introduced in 1825. It was loved by Victorian estate owners and gardeners for its bold habit and floriferousness. It was probably introduced into the gardens at Biddulph during that time. There's only one blot on the landscape. This has a very fast-spreading rootstock, which very quickly forms extensive colonies. It's long since in Britain escaped to colonise riverbanks and railway embankments and roadsides even, to such an extent that it's now considered against the law, illegal, to plant it in a wild place.
Look into any Victorian plant catalogue and you'll find a lot of space devoted to ferns. Ferns are everywhere to be seen at Biddulph, on shady banks, by water, and in the crevices of rocks and walls. They are native species here, most of them occurring naturally, with the male fern, Diropteris filix mass, most predominant. The dark spore clusters are borne in rows beneath the frond. Almost as common is the broad buckler fern, Diropteris dilatata, a beautiful species with arching, deeply divided fronds. Sprouting from a rock in China are the delicate, dark-stalked fronds of the brittle bladder fern, Cystopteris fragilis. While by the lake has been planted the most spectacular of all, Osmunda regalis, the royal fern. Its spores are carried in dense spikes above the lush piles of pale green fronds. As the Victorians found, ferns are contagious.
The fern seat, quite appropriate for this area. I happen to know someone who was a dealer in garden seeds and has got some very good deals on that. So we've got some very nice mid-19th century Coalbrookdale seats.
What's it like? Marvellous, marvellous. You've got a good view of the holly. In fact, this is the standard position where all the photographs are taken from, all the early photographs. Good.
We've also looked through all the old photographs and identified the right type of cast iron urn, and we've been putting the urns back up on the terraces, and they will make a lot of difference. It's the finishing detail to the garden which is going to be so important.
As opening day is approaching, media interest is focused on Biddulph.
On the day,
the dragons, grebes and finial going back onto the Chinese temple provide some colourful shots of the evening news programmes.
It's absolutely fantastic. I never believed it would ever happen. I mean, actually to get the finial there on it and the dragons, you know, all this talk about it, we've been talking about it for years, and actually find the craftsman, Rupert, coming along and actually sticking it on. I mean, it's a really thrilling period, you know, knowing that we will have achieved it.
Can you see it, Judith?
Okay, I'm going to try and position it over the hole.
Okay.
The final major area of the garden to be restored is the bowling green.
We've got to fill out the bank with evergreens, haven't we? So we're into the standard Victorian sort of evergreen, nothing complicated.
What sort of Portuguese laurel?
Portuguese laurel, forms of Portuguese laurel. That, yeah.
It's going to all have to be completely filled up.
Yeah. But so if you get the good solid background of evergreens, we can come down the bank with more deciduous stuff.
Good. And it won't look very good for this year, or so good, but it'll look tidy.
Oh, it'll look not better than it did.
Quite.
Later, this area will be seeded with grass, and it's hoped to have occasional games of bowls and quoits, as in Bateman's time.
But this was absolutely covered with polygonum as the best weed of the lot.
Japanese knotgrass.
Japanese knotgrass, yeah, that's right, over the whole thing. So our first couple of years were spent spraying that to try to kill it out. We've got rid of most of it on the place, as you know. But it was, of course, a much prized introduction.
And is this the original level?
We've now got it back down to the original level and taken some of the soil back where it belonged. But
you put some pines in there, for instance, quite a mixture. What are those?
In Bateman's time, he said this was an area for Mexican pines. Well, there aren't that many Mexican pines, but we have, I think, got all the ones that there were, and some southern states of America ones, you know, sort of Californian types and those kind of pines. So there's a reasonable collection of stuff in here. All this is wild collected stock. And the first thing we had to do when we got here was to try to raise the fertility of the whole place. And nobody had ever put any fertiliser on, any manure on for, I suppose, 80, 90, 100 years probably. And the acid rainfall around here is pretty high. So the pH, the acidity of the soil was very, very low indeed here. Extremely acid. You take your shoes off, you burn your feet.
A lovely picture that conjured up.
Yeah. So we started raising the fertility, liming, a certain amount of lime, magnesium limestone, because magnesium is very short here.
Okay.
Bringing up the fertility, mulching. As you can see, we're standing in ankle deep in manure, which is just the thing.
I'm beginning to grow, I can say.
And gradually we've brought that up as time's gone on, and that has been a great help.
In many shaded areas where grass wouldn't grow, James Bateman used ivies to cover the ground.
It's often thought that the use of plants as ground cover is a comparatively modern technique. Far from it. It's been around a long time. The Victorians in particular were fond of this device, using evergreens to create this sense of permanence. And their favourite evergreen for the ground cover was the ivy, which comes in all shapes, forms and colours. And of all the ivies, the Irish ivy, this one here with the large leaf, is a large leaf version of our native ivy. It's called Hedera helix hibernica. And you can see Bateman used this in great quantities. He covered banks all over this estate. Good example here, pouring over like a green sea. The leaves are permanent, they're glossy, green, cheerful, even in the depths of winter. And it's good to see that the planting here that Eric and Basil did earlier has already established. This too is the Irish ivy, and it won't be long before once again we'll have that very favourite Victorian feature, pools of green ivy beneath the stems of these old limes.
A year after replacing the yews in Egypt, the gold and green obelisks are taking shape. Nigel, like other head gardeners, can now see the evidence of his skill. All the more rewarding, because this is the garden that he has long dreamt about.
I felt when I got here that I already knew the garden. I'd read about it, and it just seemed to be a garden that I knew. I don't know why. It's got everything you wanted, really. It's got secrecy. It's romantic in a way. It's got hidden surprises. Everywhere you turn, there's something different. You've got a different aspect, different plants, a completely different feeling, almost a different climate.
On a predictably wet day in May, the garden was formally opened by Lady Emma Tennant, chairman of the National Trust Gardening Panel and a supporter of Biddulph from the beginning. The VIPs signed the book, and the first of 100,000 visitors a year came through the door. Most visitors will also, hopefully, work their way through the tea room, where 2 carefully selected plants are now well at home. No trust property would be complete without its shop, selling mementos of the day out. Finally, a small museum provides the visitor with an insight into the restoration of Biddulph Grange.
When you look at the old photographs and think what it's like when we first came 2.5 years ago, and then you look at it now and you wonder how on earth you actually managed to get it to this stage in that time. But and it's nice now to see plants going back in, and that's what we're looking forward to in the next period, is actually getting the planting done and getting some colour back in the garden and getting it just put square and put right. And we have actually got to get a system of maintenance going which accommodates the public as well as ourselves. Oh, it's nice to see people in the garden, and that's one of the things that we've been here for. I mean, we've been working 2.5 years for this day. We may well curse them, but at the end of the day, we are gardening for somebody, not just for ourselves. And it's nice for them, people to come in and to see it. And it's nice for us to talk to people as well. And I know a lot of visitors like talking to the gardeners, having a chat with them.
What do you think Bateman would think of all this, the trust having taken over and all these people coming round?
I'm sure he'd be pleased to see what we're doing. I'm sure he'd be glad to see his garden being resurrected again. And let's just hope we do it right.
So he won't be turning in his grave?
I don't think so. No, I think he'll be enjoying it.